You know, I have spent a great many years sitting across from people in my consulting room, watching them wrestle with themselves, and I have noticed something rather extraordinary. There is a particular quality that emerges in certain individuals, usually after they have descended into the depths of their own psyche and somehow found their way back to the surface. It is not what you might expect. It is not wisdom, though they possess it. It is not peace, though they have found a measure of that as well. No, it is something far more unsettling, something that makes others profoundly uncomfortable without quite knowing why. This quality, this trait that marks the spiritually awakened, is their complete and utter refusal to participate in collective pretense. They have lost the ability, you see, to engage in what I have come to understand as humanity's most cherished activity, the elaborate game of mutual deception that we call civilized society. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not speaking of rudeness or social rebellion. I am speaking of something much more subtle and infinitely more threatening to the established order. These individuals have developed what I can only describe as an allergy to falseness. They cannot stomach it anymore. Their nervous system simply will not tolerate the presence of pretense, manipulation, or unconscious projection. And this, my friends, terrifies people more than any external threat ever could. Let me tell you what I have observed. When someone has truly awakened spiritually, when they have made the journey into their own unconscious and integrated what they found there, they return to the world fundamentally changed. Not in their appearance, mind you, but in their capacity for participation in collective unconsciousness. They can no longer laugh at jokes that are not funny simply because social convention demands it. They cannot nod in agreement with opinions they know to be hollow. They cannot pretend to be interested in conversations that serve no purpose other than to avoid genuine human contact. This is not a choice they make. This is something that happens to them. The awakened person finds themselves constitutionally incapable of engaging in the countless small deceptions that oil the machinery of social interaction. And when this occurs, when someone stops playing the game that everyone else is desperately committed to maintaining, the reaction is swift and decisive. They become dangerous. I remember a patient of mine, a woman who had undergone a profound transformation after a period of intense personal crisis. She returned to her social circle expecting, perhaps naively, that her friends would welcome the authentic person she had become. Instead, she found herself increasingly isolated, not because she had become unpleasant or difficult, but because her very presence seemed to expose something that others preferred to keep hidden. Her inability to engage in superficial chatter, her unwillingness to participate in gossip, her tendency to respond to questions with genuine honesty rather than expected pleasantries, all of this created an atmosphere of discomfort that others could not tolerate. You see, the awakened person becomes a mirror. They reflect back the unconsciousness of those around them simply by being conscious themselves. This is not something they do deliberately. It is simply an inevitable consequence of their inner work. When someone has truly faced their own shadow, when they have acknowledged and integrated their own darkness, they naturally begin to see the unacknowledged darkness in others. And people sense this. They feel exposed in the presence of someone who has done the work they have not done. This creates what I have come to recognize as a peculiar form of persecution. The awakened individual finds themselves attacked not for what they do, but for what they represent. They become the target of projections, the recipient of unconscious hostility, the scapegoat For everyone else's unexamined guilt and shame, people will say they are too serious, too intense, too negative. They will accuse them of thinking they are better than everyone else, of being judgmental or superior. But what they are really saying is this: your consciousness makes me uncomfortable with my own unconsciousness. The tragedy, and it is a genuine tragedy, is that the awakened person often does not understand what is happening to them. They know they have changed, they know they see things differently, but they cannot comprehend why this seems to threaten others so profoundly. They may begin to doubt themselves, to wonder if perhaps they have become unbalanced, if their spiritual journey has led them astray. They may even attempt to return to their old ways of being, to force themselves back into patterns of behavior that once felt natural but now feel like elaborate costumes that no longer fit. But here's what I have learned through decades of observing this phenomenon: the capacity to see through collective pretense, to recognize unconscious patterns, to refuse participation in mutual deception. This is not a flaw. This is not a sign of spiritual arrogance or social maladjustment. This is the natural result of genuine psychological development. It is what happens when someone has truly individuated, when they have separated themselves from the mass psychology that governs most human behavior. The awakened person has developed what I call conscious perception. They see not just what people present to the world, but what lies beneath that presentation. They recognize the fear behind the anger, the emptiness behind the busyness, the desperation behind the achievements. And once this perception develops, it cannot be turned off. It becomes as natural as breathing, as automatic as sight itself. This conscious perception brings with it a terrible burden that few understand. The awakened individual finds themselves living in two worlds simultaneously. There is the world that everyone else inhabits, filled with comfortable agreements about what matters, what is real, what deserves attention. And then there is the world they now see, where these same agreements reveal themselves as elaborate constructions designed to avoid deeper truths. I think of another patient, a man who had worked for decades in what he called the world of business. After his awakening, he returned to his office, sat in the same meetings, heard the same conversations, but now he could see the games within games, the unconscious power struggles disguised as rational discourse, the way grown men and women engaged in elaborate rituals of dominance and submission while speaking of profits and productivity. He described it to me as watching a theater production where all the actors had forgotten they were acting. The most disturbing aspect of this new perception is not what it reveals about others, but what it demands of the person who possesses it. For once you see the mechanisms of unconsciousness at work, once you recognize the patterns that govern human behavior, you face a choice that will determine the entire course of your remaining life. Do you speak what you see, knowing it will isolate you? Or do you remain silent, knowing that silence makes you complicit in the very unconsciousness you have transcended? Most choose silence, at least initially. They learn to bite their tongues, to nod politely, to participate in conversations they know to be meaningless. They develop what I have observed as a kind of protective mask, a careful performance of normalcy designed to avoid the discomfort their authenticity creates in others. But this solution, while temporarily effective, creates its own form of suffering. The awakened person begins to feel like a stranger in their own life, an actor playing a role they have outgrown. What happens next is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire phenomenon. The individual's nervous system begins to rebel against this forced participation in unconsciousness. They develop what appear to be allergic reactions to environments saturated with pretense. A simple dinner party becomes exhausting. Office meetings drain them of energy. Social gatherings that once brought pleasure now leave them feeling hollow and disconnected. Their body, having tasted authenticity, rejects falseness like a toxin. I have watched people struggle with this transition for months, sometimes years. They cannot understand why activities they once enjoyed now feel unbearable. They wonder if they are becoming antisocial, if their spiritual development has somehow made them less human rather than more so. They may seek to return to their former state, to somehow unknow what they have come to know. But consciousness, once achieved, cannot be reversed. One cannot unsee what has been seen, unfeel what has been felt. The awakened person discovers that they must create an entirely new way of being in the world. They must learn to navigate social situations without compromising their integrity, to maintain relationships without betraying their authentic self. This requires a kind of psychological artistry, a delicate balance between honest expression and compassionate restraint. They must become skilled in the art of what I call conscious non-participation. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. As the awakened individual learns to live authentically while respecting others' need for unconsciousness, something remarkable begins to happen. Their very presence starts to give others permission to be more genuine themselves. Not through preaching or teaching or any form of direct intervention, but simply through the quiet example of someone who has learned to be real in a world of pretense. People sense this authenticity even when they cannot name it. They find themselves speaking more honestly in the presence of someone who clearly values truth over comfort. They begin to let down their guards, to reveal aspects of themselves they normally keep hidden. The awakened person becomes a kind of sanctuary, a space where others can momentarily rest from the exhausting work of maintaining their social personas. This is both the gift and the curse of spiritual awakening. To become someone who can no longer participate in collective unconsciousness, but who, in their refusal to participate, creates space for others to glimpse what life might be like if they too could learn to be genuinely themselves. This transformation, this inability to engage with unconscious patterns, brings with it another quality that perhaps disturbs others even more profoundly. The awakened person develops what I have come to recognize as an extraordinary capacity for silence. Not the silence of withdrawal or rejection, but the silence of someone who has learned to listen to depths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You see, in my years of practice, I have observed that human beings are terrified of silence. We fill every moment with noise, with chatter, with the endless buzzing of activity and opinion. We speak not because we have something to say, but because we cannot bear to hear what emerges in the spaces between our words. The awakened person, however, has made peace with these spaces. They have learned to inhabit silence without fear, to rest in the pauses that make others profoundly uncomfortable. When such a person enters a room, their comfort with silence creates an atmosphere that others find almost unbearable. Conversations that once flowed easily suddenly feel forced. The automatic responses that people rely upon to navigate social interaction begin to feel hollow and inadequate. In the presence of someone who can simply be, without the need to constantly do or say or perform, others become acutely aware of their own compulsive need to fill emptiness with noise. I recall sitting with a colleague who had undergone what he described as a spiritual transformation. We were having tea, and at some point in our conversation, a natural pause arose. Where once he might have rushed to fill that silence with commentary or questions, he simply sat, present, and attentive. The quality of his presence in that moment was so complete, so undisturbed by the need to manage or control the interaction, that I found myself experiencing something I had not felt in years. I felt truly seen, not judged or analyzed or categorized, but simply witnessed in my entirety. And so we return to where we began, to that extraordinary quality that marks those who have truly awakened. Their refusal to participate in collective pretense is not cruelty, but compassion in its deepest form. For in their quiet authenticity, they offer the world something it desperately needs, yet fears to receive. They show us that it is possible to be genuinely human in a world that has forgotten what that means. The question now is not whether you will encounter such a person, but whether you will have the courage to become one yourself.